Hello and welcome back to Tech and EduSpark Hub, where technology meets education. In today's lesson, we'll be learning about Python variable and variable naming. But before then, do you know that one tiny mistake in naming a variable can break your entire code? Sounds scary? Don't worry, in today's video, we are going to fix that. Whether you are just starting out in your Python or you have typed something like x equals to 10 without really knowing what this is working for, this video is your golden key to understanding variables and the secret rules behind naming them like a pro. By the end of this video, you not only understand how Python stores and handle data, but also master how to name your variable in a clean, error-free and professional way, just like the top developers do. And I have saved the most common variable naming mistake that beginners often make for the end. So make sure you watch till the last second so you don't fall into these traps. Now let's dive in and give your Python journey a strong foundation. First of all we have to do here is by creating a new file or a new writing block for our code so we can be able to access our previous lessons. All we just have to do here is by going to this project one file and right click on it, and you can click on new from here and click on Python file. So you can name this what we will be learning in this lesson by naming it Python variable. Now that we have named it Python variable, we can double click on this file. You can see that this has taken us to a fresh page and we can start by writing our lines of code in another page. Alright, let's go ahead by writing our input function to ask the user what is your name. Now look at these lines of code. If we go ahead and run it, you can see here it is expecting us to enter an input, and in my case I'll be entering my name. And once I click on the enter button on the keyboard, you can see that nothing really happens. But at the back of the scene, the input we enter has already been received by our computer. And to be able to access this input or whatever the user enter using this line of code, that is when the Python variable comes in. Let's say we give this input function a variable called name. And when we assign this name to this code, this way, whenever the user enters something related to this code, he can easily have access to the data or the input the user enter. All we have to do here is by just writing the name of the variable we want to assign to these lines of code. We can call the name of the variable name and put in an equal sign. And by doing this, that means whatever the user enter or the user input, we can easily get a hold of it with this name of the variable that we attach to these lines of code. Now let's go ahead and run this code. Note that you can always attach different kind of variable to each lines of code. Like in this case, because I'm asking the user what is your name, that's why I assigned the variable called name. You can always attach any name or any character you feel like to your lines of code. Now let's go ahead and run this code. If we run this code now and I enter my name, you can see that our code just finished running with the process finished with exit code 0. But since we have assigned a name to this variable, we can say, let's say print the name that we give to that variable, which is name. Now what this will do is that whatever the user enter to these lines of code or the user input, this print name is going to print out whatever the user enter or input. And that is the work of the variable that we assign to this input function. So we can see it will print out the user input. So if we go ahead and run this code now and enter a name and click on the enter button on the keyboard, you can see that it has print out the name that we enter. And now if I go ahead and change my name to something else, or let's say, okay, I just change my name to Tech, and I click on enter, you can see it print out whatever input I enter to these lines of code, and that is the work of this print function to this variable. And this means that with the help of this variable, we can use this at any point in our code so far we know the name we assign to that lines of code. Just by referring to that name, it is like us saving the data or the input to that particular name we give to this variable. And as the name implies, variable, it means something that can be changed. So just because we have assigned these lines of code to a variable doesn't mean that we can't change it over time. So let's assume we want to delete this input function and put another thing assigned to that variable. Let's assume I want to put hello to this variable name. Once I run this code, what it is expected to print out is the hello that we assign to this variable called name. So this print name will carry out the role of function. So let me run this code now and see what will happen. You can see it has printed out the hello. Let's say another time, I decide to give this variable something else to hold on. Let's assume I give it my name. And I print the variable name after I assigned it to another data. What do you think will happen when we run the code? Even though they are both printing the same variable, but at this point, when we first call this variable print name, it will print out the first value, which is hello, before printing out the second value we attach to the same variable, which is Tech and EduSpark Hub. Now, if we go ahead and run this code, we can see that it print them out following both commands. You can see this is our first variable and this is our second variable. So it is following the two commands that we give it. Alright, let's erase this. Another thing we can learn is by knowing how many characters are in the name that the user enters or the user type in using the input function. We already know how the input function operates and we already know how to get whatever the user enter back using the Python variable. But how do we get the number of character in whatever the user will type in or input? Let's assume I have a variable called name and I assign it using the equal sign to a string called hello. In this case, I know the number of character in this string is 5. But what if we don't know what the user wants to enter? So how can we get the number of characters of whatever the user will enter or input? To get this number of character, there is a Python inbuilt function called the len function. This len function helps us to get the number of character in a string. To write this len function, we start by writing the word len, followed by a set of brackets, and putting the variable we assign to our string to know the number of character in the string. In our case here now, the variable we assign to our string is name. And here now, with this name that we put into this len function, this is going to help us to determine the number of character in this hello string, assuming that we don't know what the user will enter or the number of character of whatever the user will enter in the input. Here now, this len function will help us to determine the number of character of the user input. So to print out this len function, we start by writing the word print in front of this len function, followed by a set of brackets and putting the print brackets at the back of this len function. Here now we can see that the len function is taking its own bracket with the variable name, and the print statement is also taking its own bracket. So what this is expected to do when we run our code is that it will print out the length of this string in this variable called name. So if we run our code, we can see that it has print out the length of the string in that variable called name. So this is what the len function does. It helps us to know the number of character in a string or the number of character of whatever the user will enter or input. So here now we can see the print function and the len function. The len function is determining the number of character in this string, and the print function is going to print out that number of character determined by the len function. So this is what happens when we run our code. Now, assuming we don't know what the user will input and we want to get the number of character of the user input. Take for example, let's start by writing our input function to ask the user what is your name. These lines of code, we can assign it to a variable called name by using the equal sign. So what this does is that whatever the user enter to this line of code, we can easily get access to it or get a hold of it with this variable called name. Now we can print the variable which is name. So this print function is going to print whatever the user enter to these lines of code, and that's why we are using the variable name to get a hold of it. So far we don't know what the user will enter. But now, how can we get the number of character of the user input? All we just have to do here is to use the len function, and we can put the variable name in the len function. So what this len function does is that whatever the user inputs to this line of code, which is what is your name, this len function will get the number of character of the user input, and we can also print the len function. So to print the len function, we just have to use the print function in front of the len function. So we can print the length of the character of the user input. Here now you can see the len function is taking its own brackets and the print function is also taking its own brackets. Now if you go ahead and run this code, we expect it to ask the user what is your name first, and when the user enter the name, it's going to print out the name that the user enter because you have assigned this line of code to a variable called name. So it is going to print name, and it is going to print the length of the character in that user input. So let's run our code and see what happens. If we run this code now, we can see in this case it is printing the length of the hello string first, which is this 5. So we are going to ignore this because we are focusing on this line of code from line 5. Here now it is asking us what is your name, and it is expecting us to enter an input, and in my case I'll be entering my name. So when I enter my name and I click on the enter on the keyboard button, you can see that it has print out my name, and it also prints the length of the character in the name that I enter. So this is what the len function does with the help of the Python variable. Now, this is a time for a bit of challenge, and the challenge is, can you figure out a way to store this len function in another variable? You can name the variable length or anything you wish, and when the user enter an input to this line of code, it will print out the name and also print out the length of the character of the user input. So pause this video now and check if you can figure that out and get it solved. Alright, an easy way of doing this is just by erasing this line of code. And as we know earlier, we can get the length of the user input using the len function, followed by the variable name. So we can assign this len function to another variable called length. So we can use length equals this len function. So here now we can print the length. So what this will do is just that whenever the user enter an input to this line of code, it will get a hold of the user input using this variable, and it will print out the name, because whatever the user input to this line of code, this name variable has already saved it and get a hold of it. So it is going to print out the user input. And also we have another function, which is the len function. So this len function, we have stored it in another variable called length, and we are also going to print the length. So if we go ahead and run this code now, we can see that it is asking us an input. And in my case, when I enter my name and I click on the enter button on the keyboard, You can see it has print out my name, which is the first line of code, and also it print out the length of the character of the name that I input, which is 19. So this is a way we can use Python variable to get a hold of user information or a user input. Another thing about variable naming is just that just because we name this line of code name, it doesn't mean that it is always name that we can put there. You can decide to name it another character that you want. In my case now, let me use another name. Take for example, I'm using the username. Here now, the username is the new name I give to this line of code, which is a new variable. So I can go ahead here and print the username. You can see the code editor has already suggested what I might want to enter. And if I double click it now, you can see it is right there. And here now, I have to change it to username again. So you can get a hold of the length of the username that the user will enter. So you can see here now that we have changed our variable to another name, and you can decide to change it to any name you want. So far you know the name you give to that line of code, you can easily get access to that line of code using the variable anywhere around your code. Now if you go ahead and run this code, you can see that it is expecting us to enter an input as usual, and when I enter my name here and I click on the enter button on the keyboard, you can see it print out my name and the number of character in the name that I enter. So this way you can assign any line of code to any variable that you want. But the important thing here is just to know the name that you give to that variable so you can be able to access it whenever you are writing your lines of code. And this is the benefit of Python variable, because it helps us get access to whatever we want without knowing what the user will enter, and we can use it back in our lines of code. And another thing in naming our variable is just that, take for example, looking at this username, you can see that I did not add any space when writing the username, because if I had a space between the username and I run this code, I'm going to get the syntax error. And the syntax is pointing to me that this is not a valid code. So in case you need to add space to any variable that you are naming, you can use the underscore sign. So when you are using the underscore sign, you have to correct the rest. So let me go ahead and correct the rest with the underscore sign. Now you can see we have a valid code. And if I run this code now, I won't get any error. And when I enter my name and I click on the enter on the keyboard button, it is still going to do the same result of what we want. So this is to tell us that whenever we are naming a variable, we don't add space to the variable that we are naming. If we need to add space, we'll be using the underscore sign. So the underscore will be serving as a space, and computer won't treat this as anything. So this way we won't get a syntax error. So this is what the space is about in a variable naming. You don't use space, you use underscore instead. And this way you can get a valid code. And another common mistake that is often made by beginner is just that we can have something called the name error. Looking at this line of code, this input function, you can see the name I give it is username. Let's say in this print function, I go and use something called username instead of username. You can see if we run our code now, we'll get something called the name error. Let me enter a name. And when I click on enter, you can see it is telling me a name error and username is not defined, which means that this username is not assigned to any variable. And this is why we get the name error, because in the first line of code, we are using a username and not a username. But this doesn't mean that Python is spell checking for us, because this username now, we can decide to name this variable username in case we want to just do anything we like. But this case is because we have named it username and we have to continue with that variable name that we give it without changing it, so we won't get something called the name error. So here now we have to correct this to what we name it initially, which is username. And if I run this code now and enter my name and click on the enter on the keyboard button, you can see our code is back to normal. So that is all about the variable mistake that is often made in writing our code. And that will be all about this lesson. But now you know exactly what variables are and how they work behind the scene. And you know how to name them in the right way to avoid errors and confusion in your code. But also remember that clean variable names is equal to clean code. and that is what separates beginners from Python real developers. If this video helped you, give it a thumbs up so YouTube know it is worth sharing, and hey, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss the next, because in our next lesson we'll be writing our first project, which is the Python nickname generator. But till then, if you got any question or maybe you made a mistake while coding and you want help, drop it in the comment section. I respond to every single one of them. And finally, if you are serious about learning Python step by step, no fluff, no overwhelm, check out the full playlist right here and you won't want to miss the next lesson. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep learning, keep building, and I will see you in the next one.